Spending the holidays with your family. What images come to mind when you hear that phrase? Some of you may be imagining some of the most pleasant experiences of your lives, spending time with relatives that you don't get to see very regularly, maybe for months and years at a time. You may think of laughter and fun times over a shared meal. You may think of other family traditions that accompany that holiday time together. Others of you might be thinking of the most cringeworthy experiences of your lives. You may be dreading the idea of sitting around, say, Thanksgiving dinner, just hoping that no one says anything inappropriate that leads to an argument, that leads to people voicing their dislike of each other. Today we're going to talk about a theory, family communication patterns theory, that offers an answer to the question of why families interact the way they do by dividing those families into four types based on two variables. This theory is the brainchild of a scholar named Mary Ann Fitzpatrick. Dr. Fitzpatrick argues that there are two variables that influence the ways in which families communicate with each other. Those two variables are one, the family's orientation towards conversation, the degree to which families invite each other to share ideas with each other, and two, the family's orientation towards conformity, that is, the degree to which families welcome opposing views in those conversations. These two variables that can be scored on scales of low to high mean that families can be divided into four types. And we'll talk about this. Families can be high in conformity and conversation orientation, or they can be low in conformity and conversation, or they can be high in conformity and low in conversation, or they can be high in conversation and low in conformity. Each of those groups represents a different family type and reflects a different set of communication patterns that take place within those families. Let's talk about each of those four in the time we have remaining. Let's start with the families that are high in both conversation orientation and in conversation orientation and in conformity orientation. Those families are the consensual family types. Those are families in which people are encouraged to share ideas with each other, even if they disagree, but ultimately the result is conformity, sharing a solution, an idea, an answer about the best way to do things, about what's true and what isn't. What's interesting about this group is that you might think that this group scored higher in conflict than other families, but that's not necessarily the case. Being invited to share ideas with each other doesn't necessarily yield conflict. And in fact, when we know that conformity is the goal of the interactions in this family pattern, we often find that there's less conflict in this family type than we find in some other families. So there's the consensual family type, high in conversation orientation and high in conformity orientation. But what happens when we have a family that's high in conversation orientation, but low in conformity orientation? There's families in which people are invited to share ideas, and it is perfectly fine if we don't reach a point of conformity where in a family where people can share ideas and agree to disagree. Well, those families and those family patterns are called pluralistic. And that is a horse of an entirely different color. So now we have the consensual and the pluralistic. If we look at the opposite, the inverse, I guess, of the pluralistic families, we have those families that are low in conversation orientation and high in conformity. We're not going to talk about a whole lot, and there's going to be one idea that emerges as the dominant idea. That is what we call a protective family. And in a protective family, which some also refer to as a shared social reality family, there's one dominant idea, usually held by the person or persons at the top of the family hierarchy. And that person's ideas are the law of the land. And we do not permit the sharing of ideas that contradict those. And so as a result, the top belief system is the one that becomes the dominant one. In that kind of family type, when conflict does occur, it usually takes the form of competing and dominating, again with the more dominant message winning. In this kind of family, we're likely to try to avoid conflict because it's discouraged. However, that conflict tends to build over time in protective families. Lots of people hold lots of things in for a long, long time. And as a result, when conflict does occur, it can be downright explosive. The fourth type of family communication pattern is a pattern where people have low values for conversation and for conformity. It is what we call the laissez-faire family type. It is a type in which there's low conflict because people aren't encouraged or people don't feel forced to share their ideas with each other, but they also don't feel forced to agree with each other. What this means for lots of people, this sounds ideal, but there's a drawback. Uh, Certainly, one of the advantages is that we avoid conflict, but avoiding conflict is not always the best way to deal with conflict. Sometimes it needs to be addressed head on. And for laissez-faire families, they may avoid conflict, but what they're also avoiding is the opportunity to resolve that conflict. Fitzpatrick tells us a lot in those two variables, and as a result, in those four family types. This is one of the more elegant theories in family communication research. It tells us a lot with just a few variables. And as a result, it has been a very popular theory for trying to understand family communication in a variety of contexts. People have studied things like the classic Thanksgiving dinner in terms of these four family types. Some recent research has looked at changes in family interactions in the wake of recent presidential elections. In phenomena in which people's political ideas became, I guess, a more visible part of their identities. So, in lots of families, we saw shifts where people who were more comfortable with the idea of not engaging in conversation about about political topics have all of a sudden become more interested, and we see some family types shifting there. It's important to keep in mind that these family types do shift, or that they can shift. In the early stages of family life and in the early stages of the theory, one of the assumptions that Fitzpatrick made was that these groups did not change a lot, in part because membership in these families was regarded as involuntary. But as the theory grows, as the theory continues to develop, we're also seeing that there are changes in the family life cycle that may change that family in ways um, in which, even if family involvement is still relatively involuntary, the people in those roles may change. Consider the case of a child who goes off to college, or a son or daughter who gets married and takes on a different role in their own family of origin. In all of these cases, Fitzpatrick would argue that the nature of the family's orientations toward conformity and conversation will be the key factors in determining how that family interacts with each other.